Namaste, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of our podcast. So today we have an interesting topic planned where we will be talking about the very last limb of Ashtanga Yoga. But before that, just wanted to quickly revise and go through our podcast format. So as many of you have been, listening for the past couple of episodes, what we've been aiming to do is have these different 30 to 45-minute episodes where we discuss these key concepts within yoga philosophy. And so we have been doing this in a Q&A format with several pre-prepared questions and discussion points on the topic. And so we hope you've been enjoying the content so far. And if you do have any other subjects or topics that you would like to suggest, feel free to email us at info@ekashri.yoga and let us know. And we will definitely try to bring those topics into our weekly discussion. So today's topic, like I mentioned before, is going to be focused on the last limb of Ashtanga Yoga, which is Samadhi. So continuing our discussion, we talked about all the previous 7 different limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. And today, like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the very last limb. But I hope by now, to those in our audience, you can start understanding how the different limbs basically tie together. And like we mentioned from the get-go, these limbs are not sort of sequential steps that have to be solely sort of viewed and treated in that way, but rather are different levers, if you will, that you can basically bring together in order to achieve the higher state of being that Ashtanga Yoga philosophy brings. So with that, why don't we go ahead and start with the word Samadhi. So Shriram-ji, thank you for being here today again. And so why don't we just go ahead and start with the basic word Samadhi, and what does that actually mean?
Yes, so we are visiting the 8th limb of the Ashtanga Yoga, the last limb, which is Samadhi. And the literal meaning of the word Samadhi is equilibrium of the intellect. So evenness of the intellect. So it is comprised of 2 parts, Samam, which means equal or same. The English word same and the Sanskrit word Samam, they come from the same root. So Samam, and then Buddhi. Buddhi is intellect. So Samam Buddhi or Samadhi. Dhi means intellect. And so equilibrium or evenness of the intellect, where the intellect is not mischievous or jumping around. So that is the literal meaning of the word Samadhi. Usually when we hear the word Samadhi, we have this notion that it's a kind of mystical experience which is only available to full-time yogis who dedicate their lives in Himalayas. They sit and meditate for hours together, and they need to renounce the world, and Samadhi is an experience that is reserved for them. But in fact, when we read the yoga texts such as the Yoga Sutras, we discover that all of us have experienced glimpses of Samadhi, and we will see what is the definition that Patanjali gives. So one of the things that my teacher used to say is we need to demystify the experience of Samadhi. It is not what we assume it to be. It is not a mystical experience. It is an experience that we can have while living our day-to-day life. So the way Patanjali defines Samadhi is very interesting. In fact, he defines Samadhi not just in one place. He defines it in 2 places. Once in the first chapter. The first chapter of the Yoga Sutras is called Samadhi Pada. It is on Samadhi. And then the second time he defines it in the context of Ashtanga Yoga. So let's start with the latter first, because that's the topic we are discussing, Ashtanga Yoga. And here Patanjali defines Samadhi as Tadeva Arthamatra Nirbhasam Swarupa Shunyam Iva Samadhihi. What it means is, whenever the object of awareness that we place in the mind, that alone shines, and we forget ourselves, forget the form of ourselves. In other words, it's an experience of being engrossed and being fully with the object of awareness. You see? So there are 2 parts to it. First is Tadeva Arthamatra Nirbhasam. That means the object alone is shining. We are not aware of anything else. For example, there could be other distractions in the room, but our focus is so much there on the object that alone is shining. It's like we go to a movie theater, and then when they start the movie, then they dim the lights so that it gives us an immersive experience. You're not aware of anything else but the movie. That alone shines. So that is one part of it. The second half of samadhi is that we forget ourselves. We forget our name. Who am I? Where am I? That consciousness of that is lost. We are so engrossed in it. And many of us have had this experience, right? Perhaps while watching a movie, or perhaps while reading a novel, or perhaps while playing a video game. So there are many times we experience this engrossment or immersive experience. So this is how Patanjali defines samadhi. So the word that I have heard that describes samadhi very beautifully is dissolving. It is like salt dissolving in water. It loses its form. You cannot say where is the salt. Its form has disappeared. It has dissolved into the water. Like that, our form has been forgotten. So Patanjali uses the word swarupa shunyam iva. Iva means as if our form, the name, form, we have disappeared from our mind. So we have forgotten our form and we are totally engrossed with the object of awareness. So in this sense, the word sama in samadhi means we become equal to the object of our experience. There is no observer and the observed distinction. That boundary is lost. So we dissolve into the object of awareness, the observer and the observed, and the instruments with which we observe it, all three become one. And that is how Patanjali defines samadhi in the first chapter. So grahitru grahana grahyeshu tatstatadanjanata samapattihi is how he defines it elsewhere in the Yoga Sutras. So that's what samadhi is.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly beautiful explanation, Shriramji, and it makes a lot of sense, right? So basically, the key takeaway being that you basically are one with either the experience you're concentrating on, the particular object you're concentrating on, whatever it is, you essentially become one with. And I like the analogy of how you mentioned, right, being immersed with a game, for example, right? When you're really into it, then from there's no distinction between, it's almost as if you're in that game altogether. And so the surroundings and stuff dim out. And so that makes a lot of sense. And so I think that from that perspective, it makes sense how you can kind of see where this isn't something that you necessarily have to go, for lack of a better way to put it. The stereotypical case that we've seen historically has been people retiring to the forest. They become more sages, ascetics, and renounce the daily living and the material aspects of daily living. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, because you can have samadhi with a particular experience or a practice based on how you've based on how connected you are to that particular experience or object. So, I think we've touched upon this, Shriramji, but to make it clear, so now that we've said what exactly the state of samadhi is, why is that state important, and what exactly is the role or benefit of getting into that state of samadhi in a normal, average human being's life?
Yes, the experience of samadhi is one of the superpowers of the mind. In fact, my teacher used to call these three as the superpowers of the mind: Dharna, Dhyana, and Samadhi, the last three limbs of Ashtanga Yoga, which are together called as the Antaranga Sadhanas, which means the inner practices. So let us recall what Dharna and Dhyana are for the sake of completeness. Dharana means attention or focusing the mind in one place, in a limited boundary. So that is the power of the mind. In other words, when we cultivate that, when we practice that power of the mind, then we are harnessing one of the facets of the mind that is going to help us. So it's one of the powers that we have. And then the second one is meditation, dhyanam, where the mind becomes tranquil and the mind is not agitated. The same pratyaya, the same scenery in the mind persists from one moment to the next, so that we conserve the energy. That is another superpower of the mind, second superpower. And the third superpower is samadhi. Samadhi is a superpower because we have trained ourselves to be engrossed in what we are doing. We completely give our heart and soul to what we are doing. You see, it's not just a mechanical activity. We give our full self. The self is engaged with the activity or with whatever is our thoughts that we are contemplating about. So we are totally merging with it. Now, why is this useful? What is the practical use of it? So first of all, samadhi is a very blissful experience. anyone who has experienced this engrossment will describe it as a very blissful experience where perhaps they were not even aware of time. You see, when Patanjali says, Swarupa Shunyamiva Samadhihi, not only are we forgetting the form, who am I, where am I, which city do I live in right now, all that is forgotten because we are so engrossed with it, we even lose track of time. So this is a very blissful experience. So first of all, there is experientially, it's a very rewarding. And after this experience, we are a transformed person. In other words, we are able to see things in a different light. It transforms us. In this way, it's different from sleep. For example, if you have had a blissful sleep, we are aware that I was in bliss, I was in a restful mode of sleep, deep sleep, only after the fact, right? Whereas in samadhi, we are fully aware of it. During the experience, we are enjoying that bliss. It is not afterwards we realize, oh, I was in bliss. We are enjoying it in real time. And one of the benefits of samadhi that Patanjali mentions is samadhi awakens our intuition and our creative powers, creativity of the mind. So what he says, it's very interesting what he says. A couple of sutras he gives on this. First is Ritambhara Tatra Prajna. That means a person whose mind is in samadhi, they will experience the truth of it. In other words, whatever is the object of awareness, the truth of it will be revealed to them. For example, if I'm contemplating about the subject of mathematics, then the truths in that subject will be presented to or revealed to us. And then he makes a very interesting statement. In the next sutra, he says, so Ritambara Tatra Pragya, Shrutanumana Pragyabhyam Anya Vishaya Visheshar Tattvat. So what he says is, the knowledge that you receive from this revelation, if you can call it, the knowledge that you receive in this mode of engrossment is far superior to the knowledge that you receive when you see the object or hear about the object or use your intellect to draw conclusions inferentially. You see? So this quality of understanding that we receive when we are totally engrossed with it is far superior to the knowledge that the senses can bring us, the eyes, ears, taste, smell, and touch. So it's far superior to that, and it is also superior to logical thinking, inferential thinking, step by step, using the intellect, using the thought process. So we see this in great genius people, right? The ideas that they have, perhaps they are not able to articulate in a step-by-step manner. How did they arrive that thought with that thought? To give an example, one of the greatest mathematicians who came up with the amazing revelations in mathematics, and even after 100 years of his passing, we still are researching some of the formulae that he discovered. So his name is Ramanujan. And so the way he used to describe the process of how he was revealed these amazing discoveries is that it came through a flash of insight, or the intuition comes like a lightning bolt, like a flash, and suddenly everything is revealed. It is not through the process of step-by-step logical trying to derive it. In fact, later, after this formulae were revealed to him through flashes of insight, when he was asked to prove those formulae, it took a lot of effort, both on his side and other mathematicians. It was more difficult to prove it than the process of the insight that he had, that he was bestowed with. So this is what we tap into, the process of intuition, when we enter the place of samadhi.
And that makes a lot of sense, because I think, at the very surface level, right, when you connect with something, you're able to pull out so much more in terms of useful insights. And just inherently when you connect with something, right, you're just able to really understand it at a much deeper level and really understand why you're doing it, what you're doing. And that's a process that I think everyone has probably experienced to some degree. And what different sort of stimuli or different experiences put you in that place. So I think it's very interesting to put that into the concept of samadhi. And so one question, to kind of help delineate between having these experiences and these stimuli versus not is it always good to sort of have the state of samadhi where you associate it with a certain type of experience? Like going back to the example about when you're playing some kind of a game, if you're really interested in it, right, you start to get immersed in it, so engrossed in it that you maybe lose sight and you're kind of one with the game, like we said, right? Whereas whereas the other side of the coin is maybe not having some particular stimulus or some particular experience that puts you in that state, but rather being able to go into that state of samadhi independently. So is that necessarily a delineation that matters? And I guess what would your thoughts on that be, Shriramji?
So there is a difference between the samadhi that we deliberately enter through the practices of yoga versus the happenstance experience of engrossment that happens. The difference is when we are engrossed in a movie, or perhaps when we are playing a video game, perhaps that engrossment is a passive one. You see, we didn't deliberately enter into that. The mind was swept away because it is so interesting that the presence of that perhaps entertainment, it has captured our awareness, and in a passive state we just enter into that engrossment. Whereas in yoga we enter that place deliberately. So the difference is, for example, the same experience that led us to the engrossment may not be repeatable. The next day, for example, we may not have the same engrossment experience. To give a concrete example, say we are watching a sunset and we are so engrossed in it. It's such a beautiful experience. Perhaps there are glimpses of samadhi, engrossment is happening. But the next day, watching the same sunset, perhaps the mind doesn't go into that place of engrossment. Maybe our mind is thinking about some stressful thought, or perhaps there is some discomfort in the body. Maybe there's a tummy ache, you see. So there could be many things that prevent us from experiencing this engrossment. Now in yoga, so what we try to do is a guaranteed way, a guaranteed method where we can reproduce that experience of samadhi at will. So we don't leave it to chance for this experience to happen. That is one difference. The second difference is most of the accidental experiences of samadhi are ephemeral. They're time bound, maybe a few seconds. Whereas in the experience of samadhi that yoga promises, it is a much more lasting. It lasts for a much longer time. We are expanding the time where we are engrossed in it. So those are the two key differences that the samadhi that comes through the practice of yoga.
And I assume being able to go into that state of samadhi actively versus passively has a more beneficial effect, correct? So that's a fair assumption to make.
Yes, in fact, that leads to the next step where we combine Dharna, Dhyana, and Samadhi. In fact, although Samadhi is the eighth limb of the Ashtanga Yoga, the final limb, the topic of Ashtanga Yoga does not end there. In fact, Patanjali goes one step more. He says, after Samadhi, there is one more experience to be had in the practice of Ashtanga Yoga. And that experience is called Samyama. Samyama. Samyama literally means complete control. And Patanjali describes Samyama as the combination of the last three limbs. In other words, Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi. They happen concurrently. You see, when they happen concurrently, this powerful state of mind is called Samyama. In other words, all the three superpowers we are harnessing at the same time. Remember, these three we call the superpowers of the mind. So when all three we are harnessing at once. So this powerful state of mind is called Samyama, and this is an active state. You cannot be passive in the place of Samyama. And just like many things in yoga, the combination is much more powerful than the sum of its parts. So what we experience as Samyama is much more than the individual benefits of Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi. And in fact, that's exactly what Patanjali says. In order to awaken the dormant powers of the mind, the latent powers of the mind, in order to unleash the full potential of the mind, Samyama is the key. For example, if you want to excel in anything, excel in music or excel in science or excel as an athlete, it doesn't matter what the endeavor is. In order to give the best in it and excel in that endeavor, only one key you need. That one key unlocks the doors to everything. And that one key is Samyama. And this is the most powerful state of the mind, where all the three superpowers happen concurrently.
Wonderful, wonderfully said. And I think that, tied into another question we had, brainstorm bringing up, which is the concept of samyama. And so thank you for putting that together in words so nicely. And I think it makes sense because even when you think about, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi together, right? I think, we touched upon in the past few episodes, but they kind of come together as I don't want to use the word package deal, but it's very hard to, if you're doing it right, I would think it's very hard to only have one and not have the other two, right? So it's kind of like they almost flow together continuously. And once you have one, that then leads to a lot easier or more catalytic effect in terms of getting into the other one. And so I think that's incredibly interesting to note. And hopefully our readers will be, or not our readers, our listeners will be able to understand that when they do their own practice about how these things come together. And I think just further reinforce this little web where we have the different limbs of yoga, but they're not necessarily, once again, the sequential steps, but rather different pieces that together, like you mentioned, Shriramji, put together a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. So I think that's incredibly interesting. And so why don't we touch upon what are the different types of samadhis? So I think, we've given the foundation for what exactly this experience and what exactly samadhi is, but it'd be interesting now to touch upon what are the different types and what exactly do we mean by types, I guess, first of all.
Yes, in fact, we will dedicate one full episode on doing a deep dive on the different flavors of samadhi. But briefly, I will mention some different flavors of samadhi, like an appetizer. So just to pique our curiosity. So interestingly, Patanjali mentions the different flavors of samadhi right in the first chapter, in the beginning of the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutras has 4 chapters, and the very first chapter is called Samadhipada. It begins with the topic of samadhi, which is very interesting. You would think that perhaps the first step in yoga would be a more practical step like asana or a pranayama or so forth, but he goes right to samadhi, and he does an analysis of samadhi, and he says there are different flavors in which the samadhi experience can be had. And what are the differences? He names them, and he also gives the different levels. For example, he talks about samprajnata samadhi and asamprajnata samadhi. We will see what they are in a few moments. And then under samprajnata samadhi, he talks about vitarka samadhi, vichara samadhi, ananda samadhi. And under vitarka, he talks about savitarka and nirvitarka. And then vichara becomes savichara, nirvichara. So all these names you will find. And in one of the future sessions, we will deep dive into what they are. But briefly, here's a glimpse of what these different flavors mean and how do they express themselves. Many of us have had blissful experience when we engage the mind for logical thinking, right? For example, we are trying to solve a math puzzle, and that process of cogitation, right? The process of thinking and the process of using logic to arrive at some conclusions, and at the end of it, we feel very good. So that experience, when we are engrossed in this what Patanjali calls vitarka. Vitarka means a special type of thinking. This is an experience of samadhi. This is an experience of vitarka, literally means vishesha tarka, special logic, and which comes under the umbrella of samprajnata samadhi. Samprajnata means that which has a seed of prajna, awareness. In other words, we are using our awareness towards special thought. And this engrossment that we experience is called vitarka. Now, the second type could be vichara. Vichara means when the mind is engaged in a more subtle level of thinking, like contemplating who am I, or what is the nature of the universe, and so forth. The object of awareness is more subtle. Sukshma Vishaya is what Patanjali says. Smriti Parishuddhau Swarupa Shunyavartha Matra Nirbhasa Nirvitarka. So he talks about Nirvitarka Samadhi, and then he says, so etayaiva savichara nirvichara sukshma vishaya vyakhyataha. Sukshma vishaya. When the object of awareness is a subtle object, where we cannot just use thinking, we have to take a step back and contemplate on it. So that type of engrossment, we are using vichara. That is one type of samadhi. And let's take a concrete example. Say we are listening to music. We can enjoy music in a variety of ways. For example, when we are listening to the music, if our mind is thinking about, oh, look at the rhythmic patterns, or look at the arrangement of notes. So when we are looking at the technical side of music and enjoying it from that perspective, it gives us joy. There's a delight that happens when we enjoy the technical aspects of music. So that is a vitarka mode of samadhi. You see, there's another mode that Patanjali presents, which is ananda. Ananda means you simply let go, forget about the technical aspects of music, and let the music enter the system and take over. You see, so that type of engrossment where you just allow the mind to be diffuse. It is not focused on a particular thing like technical aspects. You simply allow the mind to be with the music. That type of samadhi is ananda samadhi. Like that, Patanjali gives a variety of samadhi flavors. So we have a buffet of choices. So samadhi comes in variety of flavors, just like we have different flavors of ice cream. So we can pick and choose. Okay, today I'm going to select Vitarka Samadhi. Let me have a taste of Vitarka Anugama Samadhi. Tomorrow I will have an experience of Savichara Samadhi. Like that, we can pick and choose.
And then I think, two follow-up questions come to mind based on that. So the first one is the intention that overall, though, throughout our practice, we will eventually have exposure to all the different types of, samadhi, and not just focus on, for example, the last one, which was just, the more blissful kind of being there in the moment, that very sort of peaceful nature, versus the middle one, for example, where you said, we're in this state of being, we're one with something else, but then we're also actively internalizing, thinking through it, processing, and then using that to then further inform our interaction and that abstract interaction with the particular experience or thought or activity we're with. So I guess the first question is, should we have a balance, or is it okay to kind of have one more than another, or how do we kind of distinguish that? And then the second question is, on that second topic, or the second type of samadhi, about the whole concept about internalizing and really reflecting, understanding, and then reinforcing. So is that something that we should all be striving to do within samadhi, or is the goal to just sort of be yourself, let it be at peace? So or maybe they're one and the same thing. So how do we think about reconciling that, where the mind is active versus whereas the mind is sort of more passive in this blissful state?
Yes, when we transition from dharana to dhyana to samadhi, and the nature of the mind is such that we allow these experiences to happen. We cannot force that experience. And in this sense, it's similar to sleep. We cannot drag sleep into our experience. We just create the right conditions and allow the experience of sleep to take over. And exactly the same thing happens with dhyana, with the meditation, and also with samadhi. That engrossment happens by itself. We cannot actively create it in the next 5 seconds. I want to be in that state of engrossment. So we create the right conditions, and suddenly there's a transformation in the mind. There is a tipping point. After that, the mind is engrossed, you see. So it is not something that we actively do or actively drag into our experience. It happens automatically. So the key word here is to allow it to happen. And going back to your first question, so the commentaries that we see in the Yoga Sutras, the different scholars who have given commentaries on the Yoga Sutras, they classify the flavors of samadhi into a hierarchy. You see, step by step, going from this samadhi, the savitarka samadhi is the easiest, and then from that nirvitarka samadhi is the next step, and then savichara, nirvichara is the next steps, because there it involves subtle thought, and then beyond that, so we take a step by step approach. There's a hierarchy, like a little ladder of samadhi experiences. So that is how the commentators have spoken about the different types of samadhi.
Wonderful. And I think that's really interesting to bring up that whole, concept of the fact that there are these different flavors, right? Because when we think about samadhi, we might think one particular goal or one particular sort of interaction, but even that interaction can be very varied in how it actually manifests, right? So that's, I think, a very interesting concept and a very sort of subtle concept as well, that hopefully our listeners will be able to get some sort of insight out of and really be able to understand the next time they're thinking about dhyana, dharna, and samadhi all together in order to experience that ultimate state of samadhi. So moving on, Shriramji, so I think soon let's maybe touch upon the practical applications of samadhi and just maybe think a little bit more concretely about it. But before that, I want to quickly go back to the whole concept you mentioned where, even though we think about samadhi as the last phase, the last limb of Ashtanga Yoga, it's actually the beginning for what comes after that, right? So can you elaborate a little bit more on that and specifically focusing on, why is it the sort of ultimate step of Ashtanga Yoga, which so we think of it as the end, the eighth limb, but why is it also then the beginning? So how can you kind of have those two put together to create this one topic that's, an end, but also a beginning?
Yes, in fact, one of my teachers who spoke about exactly the same thing. Why is samadhi the beginning, not the end? So one of my teachers, his name is Swami Vidyadeshananda, a great scholar in the tradition of Kriya Yoga. So he says that samadhi is an awakening experience, awakening, because we see things differently. No longer is the mind clouded uh, with confusion and a separation between me and the object. When samadhi happens, because the truth about everything is revealed to you. Whatever you see the truth of it. So it is an awakening experience. Now, when we wake up in the morning, we say, now my day begins, right? We don't say, okay, it's the end of my sleep. We say the day is beginning right now. So because samadhi is an awakening experience, that is when truly the beginning happens. So the ignorance has ended. Now my life can begin. So in that sense, samadhi can be thought of as a beginning rather than an end.
That's very interesting. And I think it goes back to that. You can relate this to so many different concepts, right? Where I guess end is only one way to think about it, but really all ends are really a beginning to something new, right? And so I know that's a very cliche way of thinking about it, but I think it further goes to reinforce how this is like kind of a loop, right? And so again, goes to show how these are not simple sort of steps. You can go one step to another to then progress the next stage or limb of yoga, but rather these are different processes that come together in order to provide that ultimate state of being and provide that enhanced life. And it's just a way of living where you don't necessarily think of it as an end, but rather it's something that you strive to achieve with the goal of having a new beginning, like you mentioned so nicely. So I guess why don't we now start turning our attention to maybe a little bit more of the practical perspective. So when we think about Samadhi, Shriramji, I know we've talked about, for example, immersion with certain activities that can be things like the video games, any other activity. But when we think about, core activities in our day-to-day lives, what do you see as some of the more prominent ways where we can kind of apply this concept of Samadhi, and in what way can we apply it? And so basically, I think if you can give examples that'll help crystallize this a little bit further for our listeners, I think that'll be very helpful.
Yes, in fact, when we practice being in that state of samadhi, in that state of engrossment, we are giving ourselves a very big gift. Because whatever activities we do, when we are engrossed in it, when we are giving our heart and soul into it, we are not just doing it mechanically, we are doing it fully. We are giving our full self, all the powers of the mind to whatever we are doing. And that engrossment brings excellence. As we saw before, we are able to see things more than what our logical thought gives us. So we are able to use our intuition, and we are able to bring something much more than doing it mechanically. And we see this in all great people who have made significant contributions, who we call as trailblazers, right? So they love what they do. They don't do it with a no stressful attitude or with a complaining mode. Oh, I don't feel like doing it, and they do it and excel. That never happens, right? Wherever you see excellence, you see the people who demonstrate excellence. They love what they are doing, and they are so engrossed in it. So, to give an example, several years back, I attended a musical performance by one of the great singers of India. His name is Pandit Bhimsen Joshi. And when I sat in this concert, I actually was in a samadhi state for an extended time because I lost track of time. I was engrossed into the music. And when I was observing this great singer, the way I was seeing him was, it is not just his vocal box, the voice box, that is producing the music. His whole body, his whole being was producing the music. The gestures with his hand, and his awareness was in some other place. You could say that he was entranced, and all the members of the audience, all of us were in that trance state, you see. So that is an example of excellence. When somebody is so much into it, they excel in that, and we are able to bring about this excellence when we practice the samadhi experience. So I would say samadhi is perhaps a recipe for expressing excellence.
That's a very interesting point. So it's a recipe for experiencing and, I guess, working with or putting forth excellence, right? So again, that level of excellence will differ on a person by person basis, but I guess your own real comparison here is yourself, right? So basically, I think the main takeaway being, if I'm understanding this correctly, is that once you have that immersive experience with whatever you're doing, that activity you're doing something that you genuinely like, you genuinely care about it, and so you're connected on a much deeper level with that activity. And so as a result, what you can put into that activity as well as what you take out starts to be amplified much more, just given you have that interaction with that particular activity. So that makes a lot of sense. And so I guess a natural follow-up to that, Shriramji, would be, is that something that that state of samadhi with a particular experience or object, is that something that comes innately, or is that something that you can kind of teach yourself basically, or adapt yourself to over time? And like what I mean is, like, let's just take that example of being a brilliant sort of mathematician, right? So if it comes innately to you when you're doing problem solving, when you're going through the different formulas and this and that, if you genuinely care for it, those things come to you naturally, and they seem to be what you like, and you will care a lot about it. Whereas if I'm someone who knows that, okay, mathematics is important, where do you draw the line between what is innate and what comes naturally versus what you can teach yourself but doesn't necessarily come spontaneously? So hopefully that question kind of makes sense.
That's very interesting. So that basically brings us to the difference between talent and skill. So talent usually we refer to as that which is innate or we are born with it, whereas skill is something that we can acquire in due course of time, perhaps with practice and so forth. But here, when we talk about the Samadhi experience, we are not particularly talking about talent or skill. It is just a state of being. You see the difference, right? For example, when somebody is in a place of Samadhi, whatever their chosen endeavor is, they will excel in it. If they choose the area of mathematics, they will excel in it. Now, later on, maybe in one of the future sessions, we will talk about this topic, namely Swadharma. That means, what is it that we are inspired to do with our life? What is our inner calling? And so, yoga says that when we align our activities with our inner calling, then to use your word, amplification happens. We are able to excel in it much more because we are respecting our natural abilities. We are in line with our heart's calling. We are aligning our karma and dharma. The swadharma and our actions are in alignment. So when that happens, then magic happens, right? Like there is excellence all around. But Samadhi experience itself, it is not specific to a particular activity or a particular talent or skill. It is a state of being.
Got it. And so then I think the point you're making then is that that state of excellence doesn't necessarily correlate to a particular outcome or skill level, but rather it's something that you measure against yourself as a baseline. And then by that definition, I can definitely see how the concept of excellence does come there, because even when you're doing it, even if you don't hit those particular maybe physical outcomes or those particular sort of more first dimensional outcomes, when you go deeper and deeper, even if you can't hit those particular goals, but you've, like, for example, been one with that activity, you've really immersed yourself in that activity, taken out as much as you can, put in as much as you can, that state of being is excellence, and that's sort of independent, if you will, from the outcome. So that's a very interesting point, because
That's
my
exactly
natural
right. Yeah. And in fact, to add one more thought to that, so basically what we are saying here is the state of being and whatever we are inspired to do naturally when we are in that state of being. So first of all, remember these three, Dharna, Dhyana and Samadhi, are antaranga sadhanas. They are inner practices. It is not really measurable from outside, whether my mind is meditation or not, or whether I'm in a state of engrossment. Only I will know. Only the subject will know. It is not something that can be measured outside. Having said that, when somebody is in that place of samadhi, we can um, get some clues. How do they behave? How do they sit? How do they talk? For example, a person whose mind is angry, they behave in a certain way. A person whose mind is tranquil, they behave in a certain way. So there are some signs and attributes and characteristics that we can use to infer perhaps this is the state of their mind. You see? But the point here is the excellence. When we use the word excellence here in the context of samadhi, it is not excellence that can be measured. Okay, this person is 60%, 60% in mathematics or 80%. It's not like an external scale. The When we demonstrate excellence, there is an intrinsic reward to it. There's an intrinsic happiness that comes. You see, so that cannot be measured by a metric from outside. It is something that we feel from inside. So it's an intrinsic happiness that we experience when we are in samadhi and we demonstrate that excellence.
Definitely, and that I think makes a lot of sense. And so it's I think interesting how you mentioned, right, where this whole concept of samadhi basically ties in so elaborately with everything that we pretty much do, right? And so it's something, like we said from the get-go, where it's not something that you necessarily need to maybe super actively focus on. You can get into state of samadhi both actively and passively, because there are so many different types of samadhi. So what I thought would be interesting to kind of close out the session with is to maybe bring it back a full circle to where we started, right at the beginning of Ashtanga Yoga. And we have the different limbs of yoga, right? All the the 7 different limbs before the 8th one with Samadhi. And I think, in my mind, it seems to be more and more sort of prevalent, the fact that you can basically find the state of samadhi in each of these different limbs, right? So for example, when we think about asanas, right, when we're in a final position, we're holding the final position. When you're in that comfortable state where you're holding out the position, ultimately that is in and of itself one type of state of samadhi, isn't it? And so when you're doing, meditation and pranayama, same thing, right? You're one with the practice. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but even with the yamas and niyamas, you can think about it when you think about the different concepts within like cleanliness, things about, being a nice individual, non-stealing, non-harming, right? Even that has to a more subtle level that has a samadhi basically plays a role when you think about practicing those particular concepts and kind of incorporating them into your daily life. So I think maybe we should end Shriramji on just sort of bring it back to a full circle, and maybe if you could talk about how samadhi is specifically connected to each of these different limbs. I know we touched upon the last few and how they're intricately linked, Dharna, Dhyana, and Samadhi together. But maybe if we talk about a little bit of the first 5 limbs and how the concept of samadhi kind of works its way into each of those, that might be a nice way to kind of bring this whole discussion not only on samadhi, but also on the concept of Ashtanga Yoga and the various different philosophies within to a nice, full circle and kind of wrap it up with a bow.
Yes, that's an excellent idea, Vedantji. And the examples that you gave are, in fact, the same examples that Patanjali himself gives. So you said when we are practicing asanas, we can be in a place of samadhi. He says the same thing in one of the sutras when he talks about the asanas. And I think we looked at the sutra before when we covered the topic of asanas. You may remember the sutra, Prayatna Shaitilya Ananta Samapatibhyam. Prayatna Shaitilya means effort, Shaitilya means to let go. So when we let go of the struggle or the effort, when we are holding a yoga posture, then Ananta Samapati happens. The word Samapati is a synonym for Samadhi. They are the same. Samadhi and Samapati are the same. So Ananta Samapati literally means boundless Samadhi or endless, limitless, infinite Samadhi. So what Patanjali is saying here is, yes, even while doing asanas, you can be in a place of samadhi. You can be so engrossed when you are doing asanas that it uplifts you to the place of samadhi. Similar thing he says when he talks about one of the niyamas. Remember, Patanjali enumerates 5 niyamas: Shaucha, Santosha, Tapas, Swadhyaya, Ishvara Pranidhana. Shaucha means cleanliness, Santosha, which is contentment, Tapas, which is discipline or austerity, and then Swadhyaya, which is self-inspired study, and then Ishvara Pranidhana, which is devotion to something higher. Now, on the topic of Ishvara Pranidhana, devotion to something higher, he says, Samadhi Siddhir Ishvara Pranidhanat. If you have the devotion that springs up in your heart, when you nurture that devotion, then it will take you directly towards Samadhi. And some of the commentators of the Yoga Sutras, some scholars who have given commentary on this specific sutra, they say that if you have been gifted with the devotion in your heart, because some people, it comes naturally for them. Devotion comes naturally. Some others are more left-brained. They like more analysis and so forth, you see. So if devotion comes naturally, then you can use Ishvara Pranidhana to directly experience Samadhi. You don't even need to do too much of asanas, pranayama. In fact, we can even ignore that. You can go directly and gain the experience of Samadhi. My teacher used to give the analogy of the game of snakes and ladders. Perhaps some of you have played the game of the board game, right? Snakes and ladders. So you have one very big ladder from the number 2 all the way to 100. So that is what Ishvara Pranidhana is. Samadhi Siddhir Ishvara Pranidhana. With devotion, you can directly experience the state of Samadhi. So Samadhi, although it comes as the 8th limb, although it is enumerated as the 8th limb in Ashtanga Yoga, as we saw before, they are not sequential. We can actually integrate. We have glimpses of Samadhi when we do asanas. We can experience Samadhi when there is devotion, Ishvara Pranidhana is happening. We are in a place of Samadhi. So all these are, we can think of it as a holistic set of practices and holistic set of experiences. And coming back full circle, we emphasize this point one more time, namely the power of Ashtanga Yoga comes from synergy. Synergy means the combination is much more powerful than the sum of its parts. So when we read the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali enumerates the benefits of each limb. What is the benefit of asanas? What is the benefit of pranayama? What is the benefit of samadhi? We saw intuition, right? It awakens our intuition. Like that, each limb, Patanjali gives the benefits, and including the benefits for each of the 5 yamas and each of the 5 niyamas. And additionally, he gives the benefit when we combine all of these practices and do it as a holistic practice. We do all parts of the Ashtanga Yoga practice. That gives an added benefit, and he articulates what is that extra benefit, what is that added benefit that comes from synergy. And he says, Yoganga Anushtanad Ashuddhikshaye Jnanadiptira Viveka Khyate. So he gives 3 benefits that comes just by combining all these practices. He says, Yoganga Anushtanad Ashuddhikshaya, it removes the impurities in the system. And then Jnana Deepa, it awakens the light of knowledge, light of awareness, the light of knowledge, it awakens in us. And Viveka Khyate. Viveka Khyati means discerning awareness. We are able to use our mind as a very sharp instrument to see what is right, what is wrong, or what brings benefit and what brings detriment. You see, the mind is able to see very clearly. It is able to resolve the two very easily. They don't appear together and confuse the mind. So mind is very sharp. So that's those are the 3 benefits that Patanjali gives for the whole Ashtanga Yoga as such. And my teacher used to say, we begin the Ashtanga Yoga with yamas and niyamas, right? Now, Ashtanga Yoga culminates in the experience of Samyama. Remember, Samyama is the combination of Dharna, Dhyana, and Samadhi. So one could say that in Ashtanga Yoga, we begin with yama and then niyama and culminate in Samyama. So you have yama, yama, yama everywhere. Yama, niyama, Samyama. So this is the profound practice, the holistic practice that is enunciated in the teachings of Maharishi Patanjali, the topic of Ashtanga Yoga.
Wonderful. And I think that's just a wonderful way to wrap this up. Going back full circle, and I think the real key takeaway, if I were to say, from me just listening to all these different discussions over the last couple of weeks, the one takeaway, I think, and we've said this over and over across the sessions, including today multiple times, it's just that everything is so interconnected. And I think when you start to realize how powerful understanding that interconnection and those synergies, like we said, are, that's when I think you will really be able to take your practice and just more broadly your state of being to the next level once you're able to understand those differences and how those synergies and things come together, and they're not necessarily discrete elements, but more than that, it allows you to act on it in a way where you can then use it to enhance and optimize how you live day to day. So I think that would be the key takeaway from the Ashtanga Yoga philosophy, and it really gives you a framework, right, for how to think about living life both externally and internally. And I think it's super interesting how a topic that we might for example associate with only like personal practices like yoga practice, for example the asanas or the meditation, the pranayama, right, it really goes way beyond it and really honestly gives a framework, I think, for how to live both on and off the mat. So I think that would be my takeaway from the Ashtanga Yoga philosophy and what exactly it represents. But with that, why don't we go ahead and close out, Shriramji? I think it's been an incredibly productive set of discussions the last few weeks over the different topics within Ashtanga Yoga. And thank you, so much for really wonderfully articulating in a very clear and crystal way how the different limbs of Ashtanga Yoga come together and what exactly we're supposed to be taking out of each one beyond its pure definitional sort of terminology, if you will, and how to think about applying that into our lives on a day-to-day basis. So thank you so much for that. And I think we'll have a lot of listeners who hopefully agree that this has been a very productive set of conversations over the last couple of weeks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vedantji, especially for driving these conversations and identifying the main bullet points under each topic. And it requires a lot of research to be done before these conversations. So thank you for putting the effort and asking the right questions and steering this conversation that has been very productive. And I really enjoyed these conversations as well, and looking forward to the upcoming episodes. And we will perhaps select a variety of topics in the next few weeks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shriramji. Namaste. Thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you again shortly.
Namaste.